Okay, so let's continue here with our first technical discussion for the day, which is going to relate to what are the different common security threats that are out there that are affecting the network, and what are the different ways that we can prevent these with our mitigation techniques. Now, as we know, the main goal of the network in the first place is going to be to meet whatever the business needs of the individual organization are. Now, generally that means that we need to make sure that the network has high availability and that we have easy access to whatever resources we need. So if the CEO of the company picks up their voice over IP phone and they don't get a dial tone, then they're probably not going to be happy. So from the general design point of view and how security is going to fit into the network, we need to make sure that we are not reducing the performance of the network or the ease of the access of the network to some unacceptable point as we compare this to what are the actual goals of the business. And this is going to be the main problem that we run into here when we see what are the challenges that network security as it plays a role into the overall network design. Because when we look at the goal of security itself, it's kind of the opposite of what the actual network goal is. Goal of security is to take that data, whatever resources are there in the network, and instead of having easy open access or maybe high availability access, we want to restrict who can get to it and maybe what time they can get to it. So they're kind of opposite goals that we're trying to accomplish. So we need to realistically figure out what is an acceptable balance between the two of them in the design. Because if we have no security in the network, it means that access is going to be easy, but it likely also means that access is going to be easy to anyone who wants it. So any attacker that tries to get into the network, if we have no passwords on our system, we have everything is set to default read-write permissions in the network, that's probably not going to be what we want. It may at first meet the business goals, but it's too risky as to what are the different types of vulnerabilities that attackers could take advantage of. Now, on the flip side, if we have too much security, that's going to impede the access and the ease of use into the network. So if the CEO picks up his voice phone and every time he wants to make a phone call, he's got to type in a 20-digit password, then from his point of view, probably that's not going to be an acceptable implementation for security. Now, while it is going to make sure that the network is definitely not as vulnerable, we need to weigh what are the risk factors in the network and what is the ease of use and how are we trying to accomplish the business goals. Okay, so the goal, as I mentioned before, for network security, we can kind of break this down into 3 different points. We're trying to protect the confidentiality of the data, the integrity, and the availability. But again, not to the point where we are sacrificing the ultimate functionality that is going to be servicing the business's needs. So as we talk about different types of solutions that we could have for security, some of them will be so secure that you can't even use the network itself. Okay, some of them will be too lenient that will make the network easy to use, but again, too risky. So we need to look at what are all the different possible vulnerabilities, or at least what are the common vulnerabilities in the network? What are the different tools that we can use to fix these issues? And then which are acceptable implementations based on what the business drivers of the network are in the first place. So again, these 3 points here of what we're trying to protect, the confidentiality of the data, this is to make sure that only authorized users can get access to whatever resources that we have. So if our network that we're working for is a banking institute, we want to make sure that whatever personal information the customers have, like their social security numbers, we want to make sure that that's not on a system that is not password protected, or it doesn't have some type of access restrictions for people on the internet just simply logging into the database server and looking at what are all the account numbers, what are all the social security numbers. Next, we have the integrity of the data. This is to make sure that people are not going in there and changing the data that are not supposed to be. So for example, like I mentioned before, let's say you're trying to make a deposit or withdrawal on your online banking system. You want to make sure that someone doesn't intercept your communication in the middle and change key pieces of information that are going to have a big impact on the application. So maybe the amount that you're withdrawing, or the account number, or where the destination is going to. So if you're sending an online wire transfer, you want to make sure that someone doesn't go in there and change what the destination account is. They're not transferring the money to themselves. Then lastly, we have the data's availability. This basically means we want to be able to access it whenever we want to, or whenever we need to. So the type of issues in network security that would attack availability generally relates to the different types of denial of service attacks that we would see. So whether it's an attack against your web server, or maybe your database servers where you're trying to get to an application and you can't, or something as low level as someone logs into one of your routers, erases the configuration, and then you can't access any of your network resources. Now, the different attacks that are going to target these three different areas of security, the type of techniques that we can use to stop them are going to be depending on what are they trying to accomplish in the first place. So with something like confidentiality, we want to make sure that no one can read the data. That may be as simple as implementing a strict password policy, where we tell our users that they need to use uppercase, lowercase, numbers, mixed symbols in their passwords. So prevent someone from doing some sort of brute force password attack, or maybe a dictionary attack. Now, something with the integrity, maybe that would relate to running an IPsec VPN to make sure that when I send the data and it gets to the other end, it was the actual packet that I sent. So someone in the middle of the internet is not intercepting the communication and then changing it. Now, the availability, sometimes this one is going to be hard to grasp as a whole, because there's a lot of different aspects in the network that need to work together to make sure that there is high availability of the information. So we're going to break down the individual portions. What are possible attacks on the network control plane itself, like the routing protocols or the router's configuration? How do we protect those, as opposed to the actual application itself? So if someone is doing a denial of service attack on the web servers, we want to prevent that on the web server itself by running some sort of maybe intrusion prevention system on the actual server, or do we want to prevent that at the network level with a firewall or some sort of network-based IPS? Now, to figure out how we are going to prevent these attacks, we need to make sure that we know what they are in the first place. And a very famous quote here from The Art of War basically says, "Know thyself, know thy enemy." So this definitely is going to be applicable to us in security. If we don't know how our network works, we don't know what the different vulnerabilities are, what the different risks are, and if we don't know what are the different types of attacks that people are trying to implement, then that's definitely going to leave us open to some breaches in security. So if you are going to continue down this line with security and take this on as a full-time job role as a security administrator or maybe a security designer, a lot of what your role you will find is that you need to spend time researching what are new different developments in the security fields. This means that you would be on the reading the computer emergency response team messages, the CERT lists, and within the case of Cisco's announcements, the PCERT, or the Cisco Security Advisories, and you would really need to keep up with what are the new different vulnerabilities and make sure that those are managed and those are prevented in the network before problems actually occur. So perfect example of this is when the SQL Slammer forum came out. Now the SQL Slammer back in the I believe it was the late 90s, maybe it was early 2000s this came out. But if you read some of the studies about how fast that the worm actually propagated, it was something like 8 minutes before it had hit its cap and distribution, and it was scanning about 50 million servers per second. And the one of the issues was that this vulnerability had been fixed months and months before and had been publicly announced by Microsoft saying that SQL is vulnerable to this, you need to run this patch to prevent it. And the problem is that there were too many administrators that were not on the, or were not subscribing to the announcement lists. They really didn't know what was going on in their network, what were the problems, and then what were the different types of attacks that people were trying to apply. So when we look at today, some of the common security threats, things like the man in the middle or the spoofing attack or the denial of service attack, these are going to be general cases that we can try to prevent with different tools that we have in the network. But that doesn't mean that once your security policy is implemented, that it's done and your network is secure. It's going to be a daily occurrence that you need to keep up on what's going on, what are the new developments in security, and make sure that your network continues to be protected against these threats. Now, the actual threats themselves, we can break these down into two different categories. Threats that are outside the network and threats that are inside the network. Now, external threats, this would be like someone on the internet doing some type of port scan or ping sweep to try to get information about your network. This is what we are mainly going to be focusing on in this class. Okay, the reason why is that from a technology point of view, when we're looking at what are the different tools in the Cisco IOS, or how can we apply the firewall feature set or the intrusion prevention system, these are the type of tools that are designed to prevent these type of problems. So if someone is trying to do an exploit on our web server from the internet, the firewall could potentially prevent that. The intrusion prevention system could potentially fix that, because we have a clear demarcation of where the attack is coming from. So it's outside on the internet. In order to get to our web servers, it needs to transit through. So it needs to pass through these security devices that we have in place. So we have a clearly defined boundary of where we can apply our security policies. Now, on the other hand, the internal security threats, a lot of times this is harder to prevent. It's going to be much less of the focus of our scope, what we're talking about this week. So for example, let's say someone is trying to get the customer information that we have in the database server. Now, if they are an external threat, they're on the internet, that would assume that they can get past our firewalls, that they can get past our intrusion prevention, that maybe they're trying to run some sort of brute force password attack on the SQL Server. It's likely that with the tools that we have in place today, or we can put in place today, that we would be able to detect that and prevent it. Now, on the flip side, if this is an internal security threat, if we have some disgruntled employee who walks into the data center and physically steals the database server, there's no way we can prevent that by using a firewall or by using intrusion prevention. So this is a completely separate portion of network security or information security as a whole that does need to be addressed in the day-to-day security policy. A good example of that would be to have physical locks on the doors. So in the vast majority of important networks or high availability networks that I have seen, you can't just go and walk into the data center. You need to have some sort of ID badge, whether it's a magnetic card or it's a handprint scanner, to go through a couple different checkpoints to make sure that you really are an authorized user being in there. And once you're inside, past the security zone, a lot of times the security policy will say that if I'm a visitor and someone sees me without wearing my badge, it's their job to challenge my identification and make sure that I'm actually supposed to be there. So there's a lot of documents out there, a lot of best practices and recommendations on how you would develop this type of security policy, but really a lot of this is going to be outside of our scope. We're mainly going to be focusing on what are the actual technology tools that we can use in the iOS in order to prevent attacks as they're coming from outside of the network. Now, as I mentioned before, the term attack mitigation, this is referring to the process of preventing or responding to the breach in network security. Now, attack mitigation, we can break this down into two subcategories. We either have proactive mitigation or reactive mitigation. Proactive means that we're trying to prevent the problems before they occur. So an example of this, if we have a database server on the internal network, we don't want it to be accessed from the internet. We would want to put a firewall in place there that says you want to block this particular port as traffic is coming in, or any traffic going to this destination, I'll configure an access control list to stop it. So we're not waiting until someone actually compromises the database server to try to figure out how we're going to deal with that. Now, on the other hand, we will see that some areas of security do relate to reactive management. A good example of this is how the intrusion prevention system works. Now, the IPS, whether we're looking at the IPS that's in Cisco iOS that we will deal with this week, or maybe it's a standalone IPS in the network, or even if it's an IPS on the actual desktop, like Semantic Security Center or McAfee, some application, we're generally looking at some sort of signatures, looking for well-known attacks, maybe a ping sweep or a port scan, or some sort of malformed packet. And when that event occurs, then we have some action that we want to take. So maybe the action is that we want to send a message to our syslog logging server to send an alert saying, hey guys, someone is trying to do a ping sweep against the outside of the network. Or it could be to go as far as the IPS automatically taking actions like configuring access control lists or configuring rate limiting or configuring shunning to block the attacker from accomplishing whatever whatever attack they're trying to implement. So we'll see when we actually get to the IPS, a lot of interesting things that you can do with that type of technology, and a lot of this plays into what Cisco defines as that self-defending network, that technically once the IPS is set up properly, and if you are updating the signatures on the basis that they are released, then you should see that the network should be able to defend itself, literally. So when the attack occurs, the network should be able to respond properly by stopping the attack and then sending some sort of notification saying that this attack occurred from this particular offender, this is the timestamp, this is what they were trying to do, and then you could use that for further evaluation of how you would want to change your proactive management in order to prevent this type of attack from happening again in the future. So just because it's reactive security here doesn't mean that we're kind of doing it halfway and just waiting to see what happens and kind of crossing our fingers and hoping that the network is okay. There are some cases where the proactive management is going to be good. Other cases, the reactive management is also going to be good. Now, as I mentioned here, again, the first step to really understanding how we could fix the security problems in the network, how to get rid of some of these vulnerabilities and reduce the amount of risk that the network has, is to figure out what are the actual attacks in the first place. We can't do any type of proactive management like filtering or firewalls, IPS, unless we really know what would the attacker be trying to do in the first place. Now, additionally, we may want to break it down into these three different categories to figure out, are they trying to attack the availability of the network? So do I have some sort of denial of service or distributed denial of service attack that's coming in? Or am I worried about the confidentiality, where I want to make sure that all my site-to-site communication goes inside an IPsec VPN to prevent a man-in-the-middle attack or to prevent some sort of eavesdropping attack? So the first one that we have here is known as an IP spoofing attack. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning this first is that there are a lot of different ways to implement spoofing, and there's a lot of different reasons why an attacker would want to implement spoofing. So as we get into the individual tools later and talk about things like the access control lists, we talk about the iOS login enhancements, the intrusion prevention system, we'll start to break down IP spoofing and look at the different variations and figure out what different tools do we need to prevent a denial of service attack as opposed to a control plane attack or a man-in-the-middle attack. So today we're not going to get into too much technical detail on all of these. Some of them we'll wait till when we get to like the layer 2 portion, which would be, as you can see after man-in-the-middle, it says the ARP poisoning attack. That would relate to our layer 2 LAN. But from a high-level overview, basically what the spoofing attack is that the attacker is changing either the source address or destination address in their IP packet to something that is not legitimate. So either it's an unusable address, let's say something in the RFC 1918 space, which would be like the 10 network, 172.16 to 31 network, or the 192.168 network. So if I wanted to do a denial of service attack, let's say just by sending ping traffic, I could source that from the private address space. Then when the victim tries to respond, they don't know where to send that. Because if I'm attacking from the internet, they try to reply back to me, RFC 1918 is not a valid destination address on the internet. Now, likewise, instead of spoofing the source address, we could also be spoofing the destination address. And this would be common in what is known as a session hijacking attack. So we're trying to get in the middle of someone else's communication and pretend like we either are the legitimate source or we are the legitimate destination. Okay, this also is going to relate to what's known as the man-in-the-middle attack. Okay, so man-in-the-middle or session hijacking, we'll get into those in much more detail later, but it basically means that me as the attacker, I am trying to insert myself somewhere in the packet flow, so somewhere between the source and the destination, that I can either change the data or read the data to get whatever information I want out of it. So if I'm listening just for, let's say, HTTP streams, I could set up a man-in-the-middle attack that says, look for all web traffic that's going through me that has a password in it. Or look for the well-known format of how credit card numbers work. So look for a string of 16 numerical digits. Okay, so these individual sub-options here, we have the denial of service attack. This is where we would get into things like the TCP SYN attack, which is typically used against web servers to try to use up all of their resources. So we'll get into that one more detail when we get into the stateful firewall, and we talk about how a half-open connection works in TCP that's related to the TCP three-way handshake. A denial of service attack with spoofing also comes in with either the Smurf or the Fraggle attack, which is also what is known as an amplification attack. Okay, and let me draw out this one real quick on the diagram so we can get kind of an understanding what either of these are referring to here, the Smurf or the Fraggle attack. Okay, so let's say, for example, in this topology, I am the attacker in the upper left-hand portion of the topology. So my IP address there, 192.168.2.100. And I am trying to attack this server that is on the bottom right-hand portion of the screen. And I want to send them just a simple ping attack. Okay, sometimes this is also called the ping of death attack. It's when I'm trying to generate so many packets that the victim receives that they run out of resources when they are trying to respond to them. So normally when we talk about ICMP traffic and the basic ICMP echo or the ICMP ping, what would happen is that the source sends a single ICMP echo, which is the ping request, and the destination is going to reply back with the ICMP echo reply, which is basically the ping reply. Okay, so the attacker pings the victim replies, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, now if the attacker wants to overwhelm the victim, they need to generate tons and tons and tons of packets. We're talking on the scale of millions or billions of packets in order to saturate a server just based on ICMP. So it's unlikely that the attacker's host would be able to generate that much traffic. So the idea behind either the Fraggle or the Smurf attack is that we will use the network itself to amplify the attack that goes to the victim. Okay, so somewhere in the network there's going to be a segment that is used for the amplification. And let's say that this is going to be this LAN segment between router 3 and router 4. So this network is a /24. Network is 172.16.34.0/24. And let's say that router 4's IP address is .4, router 3's address is .3. Now we know for a /24 subnet, which is 255.55.55.0, we have in total, we have 255 addresses that make up that individual network. Now, some of these are going to be reserved. Usually the 0 address we cannot use because that is the network itself. And the 255 address, we cannot use that likewise because that is the broadcast address. It's actually called the directed broadcast address, which is the broadcast that relates specifically to that individual subnet. But basically means for this segment, we have usable addresses that are 172.16.34.1 through 172.16.34.254. Okay, so we have 254 usable addresses. Now, what the attacker will do is send a packet. They're going to send an ICMP ping. They're going to send it to this amplification segment. Okay, so they're sending it to that network 172.16.34. But instead of using their own address as the source, they are going to spoof the source address. They're going to change it to an illegitimate address. They're going to change the source to actually be the victim. Okay, so the source address here, we're changing it to 10.0.0.100. Okay, 10.0.0.100, this is the address of the server down here on the right. So the attacker is sending this packet with a fake source, it's a spoofed source, and the destination is going to be the broadcast address of that actual network. So 172.16.34.255. Now, when the router on the segment, which in this case is router 3, receives that packet, it does a lookup in its routing table. It says 172.16.34.255. This is a network that is directly connected to me. In addition to that, that is the broadcast address, specifically the directed broadcast address that corresponds to this network. So when router 3 receives the packet, what it does is send it out to the whole entire network. It sends it out as a local broadcast, all 255s. So this means now that all 254 hosts, because remember the usable addresses were 1 to 254, all 254 hosts on this segment receive the single ICMP ping. They all receive it and say, someone pinged me, I need to send them a ping reply. I need to send them an ICMP echo reply. They look at the source address of the originating packet. They see it is 10.0.0.100. They're going to reply to this address. But now the problem is, this address is not the attacker. This address is the victim. So now when the replies go, they're actually going to go this direction. And they're going to go down to that server. So effectively what you would see in this type of attack, it's either called the Smurf attack if you're using ICMP echoes. It's called the Fraggle attack if you are using UDP echoes, which are pretty close to each other. It basically means you send out the request, you get one response back in. But what this now means is that for every single request that the attacker sends out, the victim will receive 254 responses. Okay, we're assuming that there's actually that many hosts on the segment. So if the segment has all addresses used, all 254, the victim is going to receive 254 responses back in. Now, if we can imagine that the attacker would be able to generate something on the order of, let's say, 1,000 packets per second, then the victim is actually going to receive 254,000 packets per second. Now, 1,000 packets per second, that's not really much when we're looking at an individual host generating. So the host may be able to generate 10,000 or 100,000 packets per second. So as you see, by using the amplification segment, the victim starts to get inundated with all these replies coming back in. Now, this attack is actually a kind of a legacy attack because there's a very, very simple way to prevent it. But if you don't know about the attack in the first place, again, it's going to be the same issue with any type of attack we're going to talk about. If you don't know the problem is there in the first place, then you would not know to prevent it. Okay, but this is a very classical example of how spoofing could be used in a very simple manner in order to have a very, very large result on the network.